to be consistent, we can really only do that in a pleasant manner and with energy and passion or commitment when it's aligned with our values. And when it is aligned with our values, then that pathway is meaningful. Because to be consistent means we have to endure a lot of real pains in the butt, right? There's things that go wrong, they knock us backwards, they make us question what we're doing. There's questions and trials and tribulations. To be consistent, we can't expect that the carpet's going to be rolled out for us. It's easy to be consistent when, I don't know, you're in fifth grade. Are you going to consistently show up to school? Probably. Like if your parents are decent, that's easy, right? Because the carpet's laid out. That's where your friends are. You're going there anyway. It'd be strange to skip fifth grade. But yeah, that's not the good stuff, right? That's not a good life to be consistent in an area that's either easy or not of value to us. But if we do it properly, we're consistent because we're aligned with our values, and that's a meaningful journey.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Move the Change podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Muncie, and today we have a phenomenal episode for you. We're going to tell you how to stop self-sabotaging. Um, if you have bad habits, if you're worried about or want to break your addictions, if you have cravings that overwhelm you, anything on that spectrum of self-sabotaging behaviors or behaviors that don't align with your goals and your values, you're going to love this episode. Our guest today is Daniel Hochman, a board certified psychiatrist, creator of a revolutionary online addiction recovery program, selfrecovery.org. His treatment philosophy cuts through the confusion around addiction and has helped thousands of people finally solve their addiction puzzle. Daniel, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, happy to be here, and I'm honored, Ron.
And I'm really looking forward to this. I want to, I can't wait to throw some questions your way around behavior patterns. But before we do that, I'm just really curious how you got into this work and why this is so important to you.
I would say mostly just following my sort of like incessant question of why on like anything. And so you can ask why about anything. For me, the most sort of intriguing ones tend to do with behavioral health, which is why I do what I do. And it gets even more interesting when we look at like why do people do things that are harmful to themselves? It's just to me, it's a fascinating topic, and the realm of addiction is really it captures something that all of us experience because we all know what the right choices are in life, and we can almost never do them, even for a day correctly. And so I love that addiction captures my fascination with examining the human condition and why we do and don't do things, especially when it doesn't seemingly add up.
I'm going to hit you with a big question right off the bat, based on what you just said. In all of your experience, is there one big lesson or big way that you've gleaned in regards to human behavior, why people do what they do, and the just as you said, the human condition?
Yeah, probably the best way, because there's, of course, a million things packed in there, but probably the best thing to guide people on in that pursuit is I think a lot of people get very distracted by the surface of what they're doing. In the case of addiction, it might be, I'm drinking too much. And then they make that into like a biological problem or dopamine or just a situational thing. And really, when you understand that there are usually very good reasons psychologically that we do whatever we do, then it opens up the pathway to exploring it productively so that we can actually do something about it. And so that carries over beyond addiction as well. It describes a lot of how we just get confused and put our effort in the wrong places. So that's maybe the most overarching way to think about that, like what most people miss, and also what the opportunity is.
Yeah, I love that. And kind of looking into your work before we did this today, I love that your focus is on why the behavior began in the first place. Can you talk about maybe how you got to that approach? And obviously, would love to hear you explain or share with the audience why that is such an important avenue of exploration and one that is obviously ignored in some of the other common, we'll say, treatment methodologies.
I for what one reason or another, I don't like leaving answers at a place where it doesn't feel satisfactory or explanatory enough. And so you can also call that a first principles approach. And I don't know, some listeners might know what that is very well, and others might not. But you're essentially just asking. Well, I guess the best way to think of it is just you're approaching something as if you're this little child. So if someone says like, "Well, we're polite because it's dinner with these other people," and instead of just automatically inheriting a rule that like, okay, when we're out at dinner with other people, we should be polite. It's a real question, like the kid's trying to figure out like, why do we behave differently if we're out versus home? Like that's a real question. Or why do we behave differently if we're with other people? So there are some, answers to that, but the first principles question assumes that like we're not going to take anything as given. We're not going to just, abide by dogma. We're going to genuinely ask basic questions. And so I've always enjoyed that. And I just find that experience of asking that for me, very rich and in the field of like well-being and our emotional health. There are other people that do first principles thinking with engineering, and they engineer amazing products. So, like, there's other areas to apply that, but that's sort of what led me, down this path, and what keeps me so interested. And some people ask, well, don't you get so tired of like seeing addicts and they're so hard to work with, or they lie, or they just don't get better? And some of them overdose or die, and like isn't that like heavy work, or isn't it so frustrating? And for me, I don't get so wrapped up in that where we're just focused on that surface level behavior. For me, it's fascinating work, and I'm always very patient with people because I'm really wondering like, why does this person behave the way they do, which is connected to larger intriguing questions of just why do we as a people do such strange things?
For the context of the show, I'm sure we have some listeners that maybe have dealt with addiction at the level where you might say, I'm an alcoholic, or know people that are. But I also don't want people to say, well, I'm not an alcoholic, or I don't have a cocaine problem, so I'm tuning out. But I think one of the things that I really like about the way you explain this and talk about this is, you also can speak to it in ways that certain addictions or self-sabotaging patterns develop in high performers. So what are some maybe warning signs that a high performer could look for or recognize as, I'm struggling for the right word, but like maybe sub threshold um,
Mhm.
problematic behaviors?
Yeah, I'll address a couple parts there because yeah, one is really just trying to question or define an addiction, and like is what I'm doing, okay, or within healthy bounds or not. And the way I think about addiction is much more broad than most like uh, clinicians would consider. So, we have criteria, to meet the definition of like a substance use disorder, which is the clinical term for an addiction. And so you need to meet, a few of the criteria over a certain period of time and so on. But that that misses the essence, right? So we are really all on this spectrum of addiction if we consider any time that we're turning outside of ourselves to regulate our internal state, right? That you're already on the spectrum. Now, we might not call that an addiction if you just, you know, have a little too much to drink occasionally, nor would we necessarily call it an addiction if it's like to food. Like that's technically not a diagnosable addiction. Um, and then and so, first of all, yeah, the concepts we're talking about are really anytime we turn to vices, and the more we turn to vices in a rigid way, the more we need to get our own attention. So, to your question of like what sorts of signs or patterns might be a tell, right? That there's something kind of more going on. It is so common in high performers to have some rigidity around like how they define success or happiness. Because usually high performers aren't only performing at a high level because they're just so deeply committed to the object of what they're working on. When they examine themselves, usually high performers are just high performers in general. Not that, like, I needed to be the fastest runner, but it more like I needed to be just really good at something, right? And then it happened to be that running was maybe a natural ability, or in their environment, they had the right coach or the right exposure to something. And so that could be with running, it could be in a business position, it could be whatever. So, usually high performers just have a more generalized, sort of ambition and drive to succeed at a high level, and there are very common themes around either competitiveness or the idea of like status or prestige or legacy or what it means to be successful. There are a lot of themes wrapped up in there for high performers. High performers actually have much higher rates of addiction, including also just turning to vices. Some people think, well, it's no, it's the uneducated or the disadvantaged people who have more addiction, and that's just not true. What might be true is that there are certain kinds of addictions, like say IV drug use, that might be more common, or smoking crack. Like there's certain kinds of objects of addiction that might be more common among the poor or certain kinds of populations, um, but don't confuse that with the fact that high achievers have higher rates of addiction. So, surgeons, lawyers, well documented, like much higher rates of addiction, more than double the general population. Um, so then we have to say, well, why? Again, trying to have people follow the line of thinking that I find interesting. So, yeah, it's not just the burnout or the stress, right? We get we get burnt out or stressed because we're more rigidly attached to an identity, or rigidly attached to success. And even that's too vague, right? It's more like maybe the surgeon is rigidly attached to the idea that people think of them as really, really good at what they do, or they're in this esteemed profession or doing something really important or unique. So um, so the more stubborn we get around what we're defining as successful, usually that comes out in all kinds of ways. I can leave it there, but there are all kinds of precursors for the character that is a high achieving character. There are precursors, right, that lead up to that. Um, there are all kinds of signs, but besides rigidity, right? There would also be like burnout, right, would also be a sign. Like, that's not a normal thing to just run yourself into the ground. Like, a good, healthy person follows cues and signals before it gets to that point. Whereas a high achiever, right, takes pride in the fact that they keep pursuing something despite the pain and the effort. So there's some natural habits that people form, that the same things that lead to a high achiever's success also lead to our demise. They go hand in hand.
Yeah. So I love the way you define addiction. I think trained patterns of seeking pleasure to escape intolerable, painful emotions, I think was how I wrote it down from your site. I think there's so much in that definition, and you've alluded to a lot of that already. Again, I'm curious, Like a lot of the people I work with know what to do. In a lot of instances, the struggle is getting themselves to do it. I think especially at the end of the day, right? Like you get up in the morning, you get the workout in, you go to work and you hustle hard and you lead your team and you do all the things and then you get home and you're just mentally and physically exhausted. And so I think we know it's human nature at that point to kind of choose the path of least resistance. And a lot of times those things we choose may not necessarily be aligned with our goals and our values, whether it's, an alcoholic drink or several, or even if it's just collapsing into the couch and watching TV for 3 hours, a lot of different things. But again, as you pointed out earlier, I love the separation of the phrase or the word addiction from substance abuse, right? And so I think my focus for the audience is on the non-substance abuse type of addictions, whether that's death scrolling or um, any of those types of things. So, I guess what are some? I love the way you phrased that a second ago, like following the cues and the signal, right? So, what are some ways that our listeners could identify those behavioral loops that are becoming patterns and sort of have a check in and say, well, is this actually how I want to be spending my time? Or is this the best use? Or is this aligned with how I want to, live my life?
Yeah. So yeah, I think one thing to start with is to understand that it's very easy to delude ourselves that we are on the path we want, because most high achievers are not just like hurting the world and doing bad things. High achievers generally are trying to do something noble. And so whether you're a surgeon or leading an interesting company or you just want to run really fast, like they're all good things. So it tricks ourselves because, well, why would I not do that, right? And doing more of that or being better at that is good, right? And so it seems so logical, and people then get a little bit, we could say, uh, uninquisitive, right? And just leave it there. But the reality is, just because something's a good idea or it makes sense or it helps the world, that doesn't automatically mean that that's the right thing to do. Um, and so I think a lot of people don't ask the question because it's actually scary for a lot of people, right? If I mean, for me or colleagues, right, to question like, well, should I still be a doctor? And you're now like midway through your career, well, you finally paid off your debt. Everyone knows that you're a doctor, and they like that, and all these things are attached to it, right? So there's all these sticking points, and there's inertia, and so it's very hard to change that when not only is there inertia, but it's like, well, but I am a doctor. I'm helping people. What, like, why would I not want to keep doing that? And so I think, first thing is just a lot of people are afraid to examine these questions because it would mean sometimes changing a lot. But I'll say, like, it doesn't need to be quite that scary. Often we can make very subtle pivots that make all the difference. So, for example, for a doctor, maybe just to change the way that they practice, change their hours, change the way they take call, restructure a contract, maybe change the practice that they're working for, maybe even, change from like regular primary care to something that involves more procedures or just whatever, right? There's minor pivots to make everywhere. And I think a lot of people don't realize it doesn't need to be this like big, scary journey to like making very dramatic life changes. Um, so, uh, so I think that's something I want to let people know so that when they start to examine, I've just seen too many times people avoid hard questions about their own lives because they think it's this huge beast, and it doesn't need to be. And so the first part really is just taking an inventory of, what excites you, what gives you energy, so there are some general basic senses we have of things, and we don't need to like, the more you're stuck trying to figure it out on an Excel sheet or do some academic sort of exercise, the more you'll lose the idea. And really, it can be so much more basic, which is just, does it feel good to do this thing? Um, and so, regardless of okay, so then say, okay, well, I'm running this business, and no, it is stressful, but wouldn't it be stressful to do anything else too? That, and then some people might get lazy and kind of stop there. Um, but no, we've got to then look at, well, true, anything you do is stressful, but instead of like, oh, I need to sell the business or I need to double down and stay in, there are less dramatic choices. So it can be, well, do I need another key hire? Or maybe I don't need to add this other like channel of business right now. I'm about to go away on a trip. Or, there's plenty of small adjustments to make everywhere so that we come back closer to what we love. And usually what we're already doing is pretty close to what we love. It usually just gets co-opted by, things that we get kinda roped into, whether that's due to status or just a blind level of ambition or the world around us rewarding a certain path or a particular, niche that we weren't necessarily ecstatic about. So I'd say just, first taking a real honest inventory of just how basically it feels good, just without getting too fancy.
As you're talking through that, I have to feel like not obviously your self recovery program has been very successful, and listening to you talk, I see why. I'm just curious, what can you tell us about how that like what's that experience like? I mean, are you having this conversation at a one-on-one level with people in the program? Is it a group thing? What does that look like?
Yeah, no, so I still, when I'm working one-on-one, that is through my practice, in a physical office. I do some remote, tele, but yeah, that's still that. And then self-recovery is a way that anyone, anywhere, because physicians are bound by their state. I would need to get licensed, in whatever state I was gonna treat someone in. If I was a life coach, it'd be a lot easier, right, to do that kind of thing. They have no real governing body or state laws, ethical, legal, medical kind of liabilities. But yeah, as a physician, yeah, if I'm working one on one, they kind of have to be here, or sometimes people come in for an intensive for a day to consult with me. But yeah, the program is a way of sharing my methodology with anyone, anywhere. So it's used by people all over the world, and so yeah, it's frankly, yeah, there's no one on one or like direct time with me, but they're sharing the approach, and the nice thing about it is it's something they can access on their own time and, work through their own things privately. So there's a lot of reasons that actually works really well. Um, but yeah, it's a separate thing.
Yeah. Or if somebody was in a different state, Virginia, Florida, whatever, they could access your procedures or your protocols without actually having to come to Texas.
Right.
Oh, you
Yeah.
got it. Okay. Do you have some favorite tools that you lean on or teach people to lean on through that process?
Yeah. Like, so there's a lot. I mean, what the thing I take pride in is that I do, um, really enjoy seamlessly weaving together a bunch of different modalities. So some people working on addiction, vices, are just working on like the behavioral parts. So they try not to buy certain things or go to certain places, or they've got all kinds of rules around like how much how much alcohol to have, or when you're going to drink, or who it's going to be with. And those are all behavioral, right? And then there's other people who approach it, more around accountabilities, and usually external. So like there's like Big Brother, or kind of like a sponsor, someone, you know, enforcing some accountabilities. Other people are working more on like grounding techniques so that they can bring their, emotions. And I know there's a lot of work you do, working with vagal kinds of strategies where, we use parasympathetic tone and get the body calmed down during these urges. And then there's all kinds of things that I'm more classically trained in, right? Around psychoanalysis and psychodynamic psychotherapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, cognitive processing therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy. There's all kinds of different therapy approaches that all have to do with this. And so, what I enjoy doing is weaving all of that together so that the person isn't having to go through, okay, I'm going to do that modality, and now I'm going to work on this behavioral technique. Instead, what I like doing is bringing people seamlessly through that, so it's actually a pretty fun journey, and it's up to me, right, to design it correctly so it feels like a pretty easy and fun journey, where the user really can just trust that those things are all embedded in there. But to answer your question more directly, I think in the end, the most of what I bring is actually Eastern philosophy to this space, and so um, the ideas of like what actually causes human suffering. And like we were talking earlier, where I'm saying, like, I enjoy the space because I like following these intriguing questions. I do find that Eastern philosophy has the best answers I've ever come across to give people the best way to frame and think about human suffering. And in turn, when things are properly framed, in turn, it gives you the most efficient and lasting path out of it as well. So there's a lot of Eastern philosophy in my treatments or the program as well.
That is fascinating, and it excites me. As I would consider myself a high performer. When I first read Tao Te Ching, I don't remember how long it's been, but that's hands down my favorite book. It's my most gifted book. I'm also
Really?
a huge fan of Bhagavad Gita. On both of those, I will recommend the Stephen Mitchell translation to anybody. Like those are my favorite translations of those. So those have been immensely helpful for me. I'm curious, now that you brought that up, how are you folding that in to your practice? Are there specific passages? Is it just introducing people to some of the basic tenets? What does that look like?
Yeah, I try to present those things in the most accessible manner I can. So I try not to expect that people will like follow through on assigned readings or remember, certain passages. I instead try to just put it really plainly for people. And and so yeah, I mean one of the ideas, that's a very Buddhist idea is that a lot of our suffering comes out of our wants. And and there's so much discontent that comes out of that, and that has so much to do with vices and addiction, right? Because um, they might call it a craving, right? But really, a craving is just the mind's wants. It's a wants to escape life's suffering. And by the way, suffering could be like a terrible history of trauma and abuse. It can be as it can be middle range, like, I'm not too happy with my spouse, or I don't love my career right now, and it can be also really minor, like, I'm a little bored, and I don't feel like I'm applying myself, or I'm just things are getting a little bit dry. All of those is I'm calling suffering. Okay, it could be real mental illness, or it could just be some discontent. But yeah, I mean, Buddhism gives us a sort of way to diagnose and frame these things because that is addiction in a nutshell, right? Is that we're in some state, and when it comes down to it, the person turning to something outside of themselves is partaking in an ideology that says, "I cannot tolerate this desire or the want to escape this state." I'm going to now partake in the ideology of like life should be pleasure. I'm allowed to have shortcuts, or that happiness is owed to me right now, or I don't deserve to have to suffer in this. Right? There's a whole set of ideologies that we need to challenge, and people who more habitually turn to the shortcuts.
I love that. As you're talking, there's a great book. I'm curious if you've read it. If you haven't, it's one you might enjoy. It's called No Self, No Problem by Chris Niebauer. Um,
No, I don't know. I'll check it
so
out.
it basically looks at the overlap. or like he's exploring how recent findings in neuroscience support what Buddhism and Eastern philosophies have been saying for centuries or millennia. So, um, yeah,
Yeah, and I'm sure you've come across maybe John Kabat-Zinn. Have you encountered his work? Yeah, I mean, that was one of my earlier kind of introductions through a more kind of Western medical world, right? To essentially, like, give a stamp of validation, right, to Eastern wisdom, and that's more specifically around, like, mindfulness meditation. But it's silly, right? That like it's so pompous of like the medical field to say like, I hereby, grants this philosophy like validity. And it's like, no, it doesn't really care whether you give it or not. Like it already knows that it has the wisdom.
yeah,
So it's sort of a a funny process, but nevertheless, it helps make it um, it gives people the permission to give it authority who might not have done that.
yeah, yeah, for sure. You mentioned mindfulness. Is that something that you found beneficial for um, facilitating either greater awareness or better self-regulation?
Yeah, I mean, it's it's a general skill that's just so useful across all kinds of areas of life and feelings. Specifically in the space of vices and addiction, what it does is expand the space between when the mind wants something and when we partake in it, because it's usually a fairly automatic process. Once the person is at this kind of breaking point where I call it like the fuck it stage, where you already kind of feel bad or discontent, and then your mind comes up with a want, right, to escape that, and that's what you might call a craving. Um, well, w the moment that that turns into partaking in the thing, the object of the addiction, the dam breaks, right? And that's the fuck it moment. It's like I no longer have the patience, or I don't really wanna, like, stay on this noble path. I just want out right now, break the glass. I just let me have some relief here. And so what mindfulness does is, it helps people to really expand that space so it's not as automatic, to grow an awareness of, okay, here's here's where my brain is starting to go, and also connect that with the feelings that are starting to arise. Mindfulness also can help teach us to be able to tolerate that space as well, because that's the most functionally useful part of that, is not just the awareness, but being able to ride through the desire. And mindfulness plays a big role in that.
I love so much of that, like the calling it the fuck it moment. I've never heard it described like that, but I think we've all been there, right? And I think having been there myself and working with people who have been there so many times, I'd love to hear more strategies that you've found useful in when somebody's at that point, that breaking point, the dam's about to break, but they're tired of saying fuck it and engaging in the thing. What are some other strategies or tools that people can lean on to I mean, even as you said, just be comfortable being in that space and understanding that you don't even have to make a decision.
Yeah. So, I'll rattle off a few like general behavioral things, but then I can expand on one that I think is the most useful for that in particular. But yeah, there's all kinds of things, when that dam breaks, to just kind of slow it down or minimize the damage. Sometimes we call that transferring someone's addiction. So instead of it being alcohol, maybe you transfer it to, chocolate or something else that's still very nice, but not as damaging. Um, and you can keep harm reducing from there, where it becomes, I don't know, just a piece of candy, or it becomes even watching a show, or, it ultimately, becomes healthier and healthier, where it might be a walk or something. So we can transfer what the object is, and kind of, we're still allowing ourselves to get to the fuck it moment, but just steering it towards something less destructive. There's also, practicing mindfulness and calming even after we've done the thing can still be very useful. Um, there are a bunch of distraction strategies as well when we're at that part of the dam breaking. So those can be sensory based, where we're maybe massaging ourselves or a certain scent, certainly visual cues, guided imagery. So there are a lot of sensory based distraction techniques. We can also use cognitive distraction. So those can be like apps and puzzles and games and things that can get us out of that. And of course, it's very regulatory emotionally to have a person, right? So someone else who can either hold us or we can have a conversation with and kind of, you know, hold ourselves together more in the presence of someone. Um, but now, like I said, one of the things that's really powerful to be able to practice is where we build this emotional tolerance for that space, and that is a skill. That while I do deeper forms of psychoanalysis with people, I also recognize that sometimes there are some skills to build that have nothing to do with your mother, right? And one of those would just be like say it's a minor vice and you raid the pantry a little bit in the evening, but certainly if it's alcohol, um, being able to come into contact with the thing. So let's say it is a drink, okay? So there's a beer in the fridge. Being able to walk up to the fridge and just stand there and notice what happens in you. Okay, so there might be some inner tension is most commonly what that would feel like. And so there's like I wanna, I gotta, and there's a discomfort and it's almost like a compulsion. There's a great deal of overlap in the feelings that people have with compulsive disorders and this addiction space. And so there's an internal tension and it builds. And what the person can notice then is I can actually stand here next to the fridge and just wait. And the longer you can wait, the more you're building that skill. And I know you and I believe so strongly in like strength training and physical health. As literal as it is that like if you go to the gym, you will, break down that muscle and then get stronger. Like it's just a fact. It's not like maybe that'll happen. Same thing here. I want people to understand. It's not like, well, if you do this, it's some weird abstract woo woo thing, and like maybe you'll get emotionally better. No, like it's like going to the gym. If you can stand there, even if it's just a minute, and then you still break and have a beer, building that tolerance up, and it might be 10 seconds, and then it might go to a minute, and then it might go to 5, and then you might break all the way from 5 minutes to just being able to last indefinitely, like that whole evening or something. So there usually is a breaking point to people's favor, not the fuck it moment, but a breaking point in the other direction where it's like I actually can stand here in front of the fridge and like I know I'll be okay, and I just won't actually grab a beer, or I can even open it and like grab soda water, and I'm confident I can do that, and that'll go okay. So I'd say yeah, like that's usually one of the most immediately useful strategies to just start to build that skill, which translates into emotional things as well, by the way, because that's a behavioral thing. But when we notice that, okay, I got through that, I can do that. Clearly, I have more agency here than I thought I did. I'm not just subject to some disease and I'm an alcoholic forever. When we realize we have a lot more agency and we're able to execute on that, now it's undeniable that there must be a pathway for me here. I'm actually not a piece of crap. I have, some wins here, and there's something more I can like about myself. We now might be a little more comfortable presenting ourselves to people, even our own spouse, if we know that we're living life a little healthier, um, a little more proud, more confident. So these things do convey to deeper senses of ourselves as well.
Sure. Something you said at the top of this conversation, I wrote this down. I don't remember exactly how you phrased it, but you kind of said something to the effect of like, it may not have to be behavioral and it may not have to be a dopamine problem. Um, and I wrote down not a dopamine problem with a question mark. I'm curious, are Are you seeing things labeled dopamine problems that really aren't? Is dopamine not as big of an issue in addiction behaviors as we're led to believe?
Yeah, like the short answer is it's just a terrible distraction from what's really happening. I would call dopamine is like it's at the scene of the crime. It's also something everyone's familiar with, right? Like whether it's doomsday scrolling or food or drugs, like we all know that dopamine's there and it has a, it's the chemical messenger of this stuff. So it's a real thing. Dopamine absolutely matters. But to think of it as like a faulty dopamine sort of system or feedback mechanism, that's not a productive aim or like area to try to manipulate. So, like if people do a so-called dopamine challenge, it's more important like to think of it as a psychological challenge than like that you're resetting your dopamine. It's not like your dopamine goes through some like amazing reset and you're biologically so different. What's really happening when you do that is the stuff like I just described with the fridge, right? Like to just have grow confidence that like, I am the kind of person who can restrain myself around things that are of my choosing. And to do that is a very empowering process. And we come out the other end much more emotionally and psychologically resilient. And that's going to happen regardless of the dopamine. There's not a whole lot changing on the dopamine level with that. It's an exaggerated sort of experiment. Um, and there's so much data to back this up. I mean, we for a lot of time, we've had experiments trying to implicate certain genes or dopamine levels or subreceptors to try and predict like who becomes an addict and who doesn't. And the short story is they don't pan out. Um, there's just there's not a huge amount of biology in this. So again, the way I'd put it is dopamine is at the scene of the crime, but it's not to be confused with the cause. Those are different things.
Okay. So what is the cause then?
So everything we're describing, if I just recap and say, we turn to vices because we have some discontent, we want a way out of that, and then the problem only begins when we partake in that. Okay, well then we can ask why can some people do really well in this area and other people they're like whether it's alcohol or porn or gambling, like they just can't help it, and they're really in this. Um, yeah, we have done amazing studies over many years to follow what kinds of people develop addiction and what kinds of people don't. And the best things that we have found that are very consistent is that people who have addictions have higher rates of feeling like they don't belong, and they have very high rates of emotional dysregulation. And and the way I would even be more specific is developing an intolerance for bad emotional states. And those things begin very early. So we don't get addicted because at 17 or 30 we're introduced to some addictive chemical and now it like took over and hijacked my dopamine. That's not how it works. Otherwise, really everyone would be a terrible addict. Like obviously there's more to discern there. So it starts way earlier than the first time you partake in whatever the thing is. And so there are different pathways, but to be real brief, sometimes it looks like you might imagine, and you're getting abused or go through some traumas early on, and life feels insecure. You don't have good role models or nurturing or warmth to where you learn how to emotionally regulate. The world doesn't feel safe, and so that person's dysregulated. They're they're never quite like calm or feel safe, and so that is a bad setup, right? For feeling like I've got to find some shortcut to that feeling because I can't get it on my own naturally. And then we can also fall into addiction, and this is more common among high achievers. Although a lot of the high achievers I treat surprising to the outsiders, do have, histories of being molested, abused, or grow up in, like, real poverty, and feel less than because, and they make a commitment, right, to never have a place that runs out of, water or electricity or anything. So there's like poverty is a very strong driver to high achieving. But the other one that confuses a lot of people is sometimes it looks like, well, everything's right. You grow up in middle class, middle upper class, no terrible traumas, everything's pretty good. And in those cases, often there are pressures or there's a lot of overbearingness in the parents, a lot of expectations, and that's another pathway to feeling like you're out of place, not up to par, less than, and so those people often really blame themselves for a lot more than they need to, and develop this kind of unhealthy, ambition and drive to be able to be to feel valid or to be finally seen in a way that is unreasonable. And so I'm just giving an example of like there's more pathways than just terrible traumas, but in the end, usually the person feels a little bit different or not like they don't feel like they totally belong. And there's a dysregulation emotionally.
Well, Daniel, we're coming up on time here. Before I ask you the final question, I want to give you a chance to tell people where they can get more of your work and maybe interact with you. I know we mentioned earlier selfrecovery.org. We'll put a link to that in the show notes, but anywhere else?
Yeah, that's really it. Yeah, I mean, if you're interested, it's at selfrecovery.org, and there's of course some information about what it is, and yeah, I mean, if for anyone that's just feeling and sense somewhere in them like they turn a little more to external things to get through emotionally. um yeah, I wouldn't concern yourself whether you think, it's only for hardcore addicts or something. It's people use it for all kinds of more subtle vices.
Right. I'm really curious to hear how you're going to answer this question. Our final question for almost all of our guests is your number one tip to be more consistent. And given the work that you do and everything we talked about, I can't wait to hear your answer.
Yeah, so to be consistent, I think of it like we can really only do that in a pleasant manner and with energy and passion or commitment when it's aligned with our values. And when it is aligned with our values, then that pathway is meaningful. Because to be consistent means we have to endure a lot of real pains in the butt, right? There's things that go wrong, they knock us backwards, they make us question what we're doing. There's questions and trials and tribulations. And so, to be consistent, we can't expect that the carpet's going to be rolled out for us. It's easy to be consistent when, I don't know, you're in fifth grade. Are you going to consistently show up to school? Probably. Like if your parents are decent, that's easy, right? Because the carpet's laid out. That's where your friends are. You're going there anyway. It'd be strange to skip fifth grade. Um, but yeah, that's not the good stuff, right? That's not a good life to be consistent in an area that's either easy or not of value to us. But if we do it properly, we're consistent because we're aligned with our values, and that's a meaningful journey. And so when we get knocked down, the and I know this is very much, within your philosophy, you want to work through those things because that is where the value is, right? So let's say to be consistent with your work or say with a spouse, the value is that, my wife is such a prize to me that when we have a disagreement or conflict or it's not easy, digging in and working through that is why it's a valuable relationship, right? So it's all to me around meaning. That's how I can consistently show up there. But if I instead the alternative is view it like it better be working for me or it better give me, immediate kind of feedback that it's rewarding, that's when we can fail because, well, of course I'm going to question the path or not show up. If it's if I don't see a more sort of long-term arc of what I want out of it and understand where I am in that.
Oh man, that's such a great answer, Daniel. I love it. Thank you so much for being a guest on the Move the Change podcast with us today.
Yeah. Thanks, Ryan. I like your work, and it's an honor to be on.
All right, for everybody listening, thanks for being here. We'll catch you on the next episode. If you enjoyed this chat with Daniel, make sure you share this with somebody you know who will benefit from the things that we've been talking about today. And as always, we'll catch you on the next episode.